I'm Ann McDowell, and I'm an English as a second language teacher. We just say ESL teacher usually. I work at an intensive English program, we call that an IEP, at the University of Pennsylvania. There are intensive English programs all over the country, and mine, as well as most, entail college-age students. The youngest we take is 17, so that means they finished high school, and perhaps they haven't started college yet. And then we have students who are postdocs, who are here, they're scientists at the university, and they just need to improve their English. So anywhere from 17 to adult age, but the majority are young adults, and they're here in the United States to study English. They're not matriculated students at the University of Pennsylvania. They're simply here to study English. Many of them, their goals are to go on to a university, and they want to pass the English test that they have to take. It's called the TOEFL. And so we help prepare them for that. Overall, we like to help them with their reading, their writing, their listening, and their speaking in English. And of course, that also includes grammar and pronunciation. So we just get them using the language. We get them interacting with the language, and we try to immerse them in the language. The fact that they're living in an English-speaking country helps a lot with that immersion process. I wanted to go into the Peace Corps after college. I was directionless, to tell you the truth. And I thought the Peace Corps would be a fun adventure. I could travel, learn a new language. But I got accepted, but then it's a 6-month waiting period, or it was back then, before they gave you your assignment. And I didn't want to wait 6 months to start working when I graduated. So I applied to Teach for America, which is similar to the Peace Corps in that you're doing a 2-year assignment and you're going to a difficult or challenging location where they don't have enough teachers. So I had no teacher training. I had a major in Spanish, so they sent me to Los Angeles. So it was definitely an adventure. I'm from a small town, so I was a little overwhelmed being in the city in Los Angeles and dealing with gangs and drugs and things like that. So I, for some reason, fell in love with teaching despite all of that, and decided to continue to pursue a career as an ESL teacher. I was a bilingual education teacher in Los Angeles because I spoke some Spanish, not perfectly. So I was supposed to teach 75% of the day in Spanish and then 25% in English. And I had a 3rd grade class. So it was a juggling act. It was a lot for me to take on, a small town girl, but I survived. And I went to my hometown and ended up in migrant education so that I could use my Spanish, and I taught ESL, not bilingual ed. The class was all in English, but modified the English so that someone who was learning the language for the first time could digest what we were saying and doing. So I taught all my subjects in modified English, science, math, everything. I started out in 2nd grade. I also taught 3rd grade and then ended up in kindergarten. Loved kindergarten, stayed there many years. And then I came to Pennsylvania to get a master's in teaching English as a second language. They call that MS-TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages. I went to the University of Pennsylvania and never left. Started teaching there to help support going to school. And I've been working with international students at Penn for the remainder of my career. It can really vary depending on who you're working with. Overall, I would say a love of culture and language. So if you're not interested in other cultures, you don't like diversity, and you don't particularly like studying a foreign language yourself, I don't recommend this field to you. But if you love those things, you could perhaps be a natural fit. I always loved learning new languages and new cultures. If you love one particular culture, you could focus on working with that particular group. I find that in an intensive English program at a university, the population changes every 5 to 10 years. So you have to be the kind of person who loves to learn a new culture every few years. You can't dig your feet in the sand and say, oh, I really get how this group works. And then you're not ready for the next group. So you always have to be ready to learn a new culture. And if you've never learned a foreign language, you perhaps will never fully understand the pain and suffering that your students are going through when they're trying to learn English. So it's very helpful to be a person who speaks at least one other language. You can reassure your students you've been through the process, and it's very comforting to them instead of just demanding you're not working hard enough. Sometimes these skills just take time and practice, and you'll know that if you yourself have studied a foreign language. It really varies in the ESL profession. It varies from state to state and from age group. So, starting with, say, elementary education, every state has their own certification program. So, you would need to research that. I can tell you from experience that there's often a 2 year emergency certification that you can get. And that means you basically don't have any training, but you can learn on the job and take classes, and you have 2 years to complete the coursework. When I was coming out of college, there were 5 classes required of me. That could have changed. I'm no longer in elementary ed. So that's something you'd want to look into if that's the field you wanted to pursue. I shouldn't say elementary, I should say that would include middle school and high school as well. Each state is going to vary. For an intensive English program at a university or, say, a community college or something of that nature, typically a master's degree is required. At least you're working toward your master's degree, perhaps toward the back end of it, before they'll hire you. They also want to see that you've lived overseas because your students are all living overseas. And so you need to comprehend what that's like on a daily basis, and that you're a person who speaks more than one language. Those are all requirements. Live overseas, speak more than one language, and have a master's degree. And then it goes down from there depending on the age group and the state. The best part about my workplace atmosphere is probably my coworkers. They're all very well traveled. A lot of them are published, so they're at the top of their game. So I feel very challenged every day, and I love the collegiality and just the fact that I can go to anyone on staff with any of my questions. So I can always find someone who's an expert at something that I'm not an expert at. And people are very helpful in my field. In general, they seem to be friendly types of people, very well traveled, very highly educated, interesting to work with. They always challenge me in a good way. And I enjoy coming to work because of my coworkers. And for the most part, my students are also highly motivated. They're here because they want to be here. If you were in a situation like a public school situation, you're also an advocate for your students who often feel marginalized and up against a system that isn't working for them. And so often you're their advocate. So when they see you coming, it's like, oh, it's a friend, someone who cares about me. Whereas maybe their classroom teacher, they might feel a lot of pressure from that person and they're not up to standard or whatever. Here comes the person who gets me. That has been one of the most exciting parts. And I think what attracted me to the field, being an extrovert, I like to enjoy the people I'm with all day. And this is a great field for someone who is a people person. A typical ESL job is probably a 35 to 45 hour a week job. Travel it varies. So some of my coworkers get paid to go teach at a university in Japan, for instance, for a semester or for a couple of weeks to do a specialized course, something like that. There are a lot of jobs overseas. So if you're the kind of person who wants to work overseas, ESL is an excellent field. You can almost always find a job somewhere. It may not be the place where you want to go. So if you'd like to go to Asia or the Middle East, you can easily, no problem, find a job, particularly if you have a master's degree in teaching English. Enjoy learning language yourself. Enjoy learning about anthropology or culture. Not so much physical anthropology, but cultural anthropology is what I meant to say. And enjoy travel yourself because that's what your students will be experiencing. They will have traveled to come to you, or you traveled to come to them, perhaps, if you're living overseas. But if they're studying English, it's probably because they're going to be doing some traveling. So if you're the kind of person who enjoys those things, then you will enjoy the job as well. Another great tip that one of my teachers taught me when I was getting my master's degree was when you're writing your lesson plans, think about if your kid was sitting in that room, is this something that you'd want them to be learning? Instead of just whipping through it, you're tired, try to think about somebody that you love was taking that class. Would you want this information for them? It helps you to stay focused and motivated. And actually, by the time you reach my age, you start thinking of your students as your own children in some sense. And sometimes they appreciate that love and concern and care that you have for them. I'll start at the end. I never leave work until I'm 100% ready for class the next day. I'm not a morning person, so I don't like rushing in and needing to make photocopies or find something. So I have everything neatly stacked up so I can grab it and run to class. That's served me very well over the years. So how does my day start? Usually everything's all prepared and I go straight to class. So usually you do some sort of a review with your students, whatever you've been studying. Then perhaps you do a warm-up, which might be interactive. It might get them physically moving around the room, get their blood flowing into their brain, get them thinking about the topic, laughing, relaxing. So usually a warm-up is a game, something, lighthearted, where I'm not taking notes. You made a mistake, and they're not getting a grade on it. Then perhaps we go into some sort of a new thing we're learning. Maybe it's a grammar point. Say that we're talking about the verb to be and how to use that in the present tense. He is, we are, something like that. Then you perhaps introduce the material. Then you perhaps use it as a whole group together. Then maybe they do a pair practice together where they might talk about themselves. I am a student, I am studying English, whatever. And then perhaps they have a homework exercise where they're going to review the information. And then usually at the end of the class, there's some kind of a recap where you go over things. And like I said, when my day is over, I go back to my office. If I did something not very well, I want to reflect on that. Perhaps I want to meet with some coworkers and say, this isn't working. My students, the material is not resonating with them. I think they're not interested in the topic we're talking about, the pop culture or technology. Maybe it's outdated, whatever. I have to work through those issues if my students weren't really excited about class. There has to be buy-in. The students have to be interested in the topic so they don't fall asleep. So in some ways, you're somewhat of an entertainer as an ESL teacher. You also have to know your stuff. Like, you really need to know the material because they will ask difficult questions. After you've been teaching 20 some odd years, such as myself, you've kind of memorized it all, but the first couple years can be a little rough and you have to fake it and say, good question, I'll answer that tomorrow. We don't have time today, which translation means I don't know right now. So sometimes there's a little research involved if the students are asking some tricky questions. And then I plan out my next day. Usually I have the whole course sort of mapped out in my mind as a big picture before I even start. But then the details have to be fine-tuned on a daily basis because I don't exactly know how long it's going to take my students to grasp something. It honestly varies from class to class. And then I spend a big chunk of time giving feedback to my students because they really value feedback. And they want to know, did I do everything perfectly? What could I have done differently? So perhaps the main goal is teaching communication in English, mainly via reading, writing, listening, and speaking in English, the ability to do those things. Of course, we also cover grammar, pronunciation. Mainly what we offer are courses. That can be anywhere from preschool, very small children, up through postdoctorates to older adults who are working full time and taking classes at night. Another interesting area that's kind of a little bit new right now are MOOCs, and that's a massive online course. And in a MOOC, right now at the university, we have a few of these MOOCs out there. We have something like 25,000 students. I think one of them has 200,000 students in it. And what you're doing is you're setting up the course online. Students are interacting with it pretty much in their own time frame. And then you're giving a lot of feedback. Now, what my coworkers have found is that you usually only have a handful of students who are interacting with the material every day. However, at times you'll have a group of co-teachers all working on the course together because there are so many students. Perhaps the political climate. A lot of my coworkers are very concerned about the xenophobia that seems to be on the rise, fear of foreigners, fear of terrorists and immigrants. And so we're afraid that if the laws become very strict, that we will lose students. I'm not too worried. What I've seen happen over the years is that the climate changes every 5 to 7 years. So when I first started, most students were from Latin America, Spanish speakers. Then, so that would have been around the early 90s. So I was in that realm for about 10 years. Then, when I came to Pennsylvania, most of my students were Asian, mostly from Korea, also a lot from Japan. And they had come to the university simply to learn English. And we also had a lot of businessmen and women, mainly from Japan. So then the climate switched again more in the past like 10 years or so. We've been dealing with mostly Middle Eastern students who are over here to learn English. We have these Sabic students who are on scholarship. They're quite bright, and they're from Saudi Arabia. So they're the cream of the crop from Saudi Arabia and from other Middle Eastern countries as well. Now, with the current political climate, we've seen a sudden decrease in Middle Eastern students, but we've experienced a rise in Chinese students. So I recently taught a class that was 100% Chinese students. So I think what challenges we face are staying flexible and exploring new markets, which my boss is excellent at. He's always bringing in new students from different parts of the world. If you're not ready to do that, you could see your program close down because the markets are constantly changing. So my boss has to keep his fingers in a lot of different pots. And some of my coworkers have been able to travel with him and help with marketing, and that's a really interesting opportunity. Another great way to find students is through technology and through online mediums. So I think you just have to remain vigilant, and you have to remain flexible and motivated. And so far, I mean, I've been in the field for 25 years and I've never had any trouble finding a job. So I think just go with the flow. About every 5 to 10 years, we see a shift, at least in the intensive English programs around the country. So, for instance, when I first started teaching, that would have been around 1991, most of the population that came to the US and who were studying English as a second language were from Spanish speaking countries in Latin America. And that was the almost 100% of the student body. Then, about 10 years later, when I came to the University of Pennsylvania, early 2000, almost all of our students were Asian, mostly Korean and Japanese, a lot of businessmen and women from Japan. Then it shifted again, the population shifted, and we had mostly students from the Middle East. We had scholars on scholarship from Saudi Arabia and Oman recently, so we got the cream of the crop from those countries, which was really fun. And very recently, we've had mainly Chinese. So there's always a shift, and you never know next year which group is going to be interested in ESL. 10 years from now, I suspect that technology will be more and more involved, and there'll be more distance learning. Technology has always affected education. Not all educators have been willing to make the changes they need to make to keep up with the technology. I confess it's a challenge for me the older that I get, but it's also fun to learn new things. So I'm excited to see where technology might take us in the next 10 years.